All right, everybody. Thank y'all for tuning in. I'm Dustin Seaton, the Gifted and Talented Specialist at the Northwest Arkansas Education Service Cooperative, or NWA-ESC. I'm also president of Arkansans for Gifted and Talented Education. And tonight we have Dr. Jonathan Wai, the Assistant Professor and Endowed Chair of Education Policy at the University of Arkansas, as well as Sarah McKenzie, Executive Director for the Office for Education Policy at the University of Arkansas. And we appreciate y'all tuning in tonight to talk about how our best practices and gifted and talented identification. We know there's no magic bullet. It's a challenge that everyone deals with throughout the country, but especially here in Arkansas, that we want to find best practices. What are some things that we can do to utilize and overcome some of the challenges that we see every day in practice? So I've asked Dr. McKenzie and Dr. Wai to assist, and we'll jump right in. So there are several challenges. The elephant in the room is that we know that identifying GT kids in Arkansas or in anywhere is not an easy task, and there's not one uniformed or magic pill that will identify, a magic wand that will identify our kids. In Arkansas, districts identify differently based on their gifted programming. There are very few common assessments from district to district, and sometimes even within district to district, neighboring districts, that gifted label doesn't always transfer with the student, because again, districts identify differently. Even districts don't even like always sharing that data of what they've collected on students when students do transfer. We all know in reality that there's problems with appropriate training for the assessments, from anywhere from the academic style like COGAT to more of a creative style like Torrance or the Williams Divergent. Funding is always an issue. Funding for new assessments is a problem. We know best practices have said do localized norming, but we also don't know how to do that, or we don't have time to do that, or we haven't been trained to do that. And so that's an obstacle, even though research does say these are some of the best things for identifying our GT kids. Referrals, though, can happen at any time in Arkansas. So we can do it at the beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of the year. And once you start that referral process here in Arkansas, you have to do the full gamut, which is the 2 subjective, 2 objective, with at least one of those criteria being a creative assessment. So that requires a lot of time. And oftentimes it can be a few weeks or a few months. Ideally, we want to do what's best practices for the kid or the student being referred. But as any new coordinator out there can say, one of the biggest challenges that we see when we step into the role, I did this myself as a new coordinator, is you're often just, here's our assessments, here's what we've always done, go out and do it. So when I became a specialist at Northwest Arkansas at the co-op, I learned that I wasn't an isolated issue, that where I was in my district, other districts around the state were having that same problem. And as soon as a district coordinator got comfortable with their identification process, oftentimes they moved or got reassigned into another role. And so understanding that we have very few common assessments was a big hurdle that I thought my districts in Northwest Arkansas could collectively come together and say, let's do at least one common assessment. But there are all, as you can see on the screen, there's a whole list of other issues with our identification processes. So I reached out to our local university in our backyard, the University of Arkansas, and thankfully I actually taught some of Dr. Sarah McKenzie's children in the Gifted and Talented program. And so it was very nice that I had that connection to start developing more of a research practice partnership. And then Dr. Jonathan Wai came to Northwest Arkansas as well a few years ago, and we made that connection. And I said, here are some of our challenges. We need to find some solutions for our district. So that leads us to kind of the next slide about research practice partnership. So I'll let Dr. Wai take it over from here.
Sarah, were you going to do this one, or did you want me to do it?
I'm fine to do it if that's.
Go ahead.
Fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
So what is a research practice partnership? One of the things that I noticed when I left the school district and went to the university is that there's these very siloed research projects where it's like the researcher will come in and do a project on your students or with your teachers, but it's really it's really informing them. It's not necessarily informing the school district. or the school or the students. So there's this new idea that's been going on for a while about joining universities or research groups with school districts to help them identify and solve problems that the practitioners or policymakers are having within the school. So the research becomes helpful both to the researcher and to the school district. It's really interesting because, a lot of times researchers want to do like random assignment. So randomized controlled trials, you guys have been hearing about those with the vaccines. They are the gold standard. And unfortunately, we don't use those a lot in school districts. So it makes research a little bit more convoluted. You can't just say, well, we're going to randomly assign half of these kids to gifted and half of them not to gifted and see what happens. So we started this with Dustin to help solve this problem that he was talking about gifted identification and what are some of the best practices. And this is an ongoing conversation that we'll continue to have over multiple years. And hopefully it provides some insight to you, the practitioners that are on the ground every day. And hopefully you can provide feedback to us to make it more useful to you. John, did you want to add anything else?
I think, Sarah, that was great. I think you hit most of the things. I would just say, as a research coming into this process, I had mostly been involved with research. And so getting to know Dustin and getting to know Sarah really helped me as a researcher understand, how research can sometimes inform practice, but how practice can also ultimately inform research. And that made me think differently about my own research questions.
And I think I highlighted on the screen the fact that researchers and practitioners do speak like different languages or have different needs. Because when I was taking classes to get my GT certification, I had an excellent training at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and then when I transferred to the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, the professors were excellent at it. But they would tell me, here's best practices, and I would go to my day job and I'm like, I can't do that. I don't have time. I don't have money. I don't have the resources. And it was a big disconnect. And so I wanted to make sure that when we started this project that we could find a way to bridge that connection from research to practitioners. And I think Dr. Wai and Dr. McKenzie have done a great job with that. So next slide. When I first got onto more of a regional perspective, I learned that pretty much commonly from district to district, we generally identify in each district about 5 to 12%. I think the average was 9% of GT students or students in their district as identified as gifted and talented. And that has a range though all across Arkansas. There's been as little as 2% in some districts and some districts as high as 21%. But again, most districts change when they do it and how they do it. Some districts do it universally at the end of first grade. Some do it more kind of sporadically through third, fourth, and fifth grade. But generally, most districts have a formal identification process for most kids or all kids by about third grade or fourth grade. But again, it varies district by district or region by region. In Arkansas, we do have really strong standards in terms of identification requirements, which is something I really have come to learn and respect the fact that we have at least 2 subjective criteria and at least 2 objective criteria, with at least one of those being a creativity assessment. And it could be a Renzulli rating scale, or it could be something more formal like the Torrance verbal or figurative scale. And again, referrals or nominations for students to be tested can happen at any time and made by anyone in Arkansas with knowledge of the student. But again, there are discrepancies of when that happens and the timing of it and so forth from that. Was there anything else y'all want to add about this slide? I literally hear crickets outside of.
Yeah, it's cricket.
Okay.
One of the things that I didn't say earlier, though, Dustin, sorry, was that OEP, my Office for Education Policy, we're actually in a research practice partnership with sort of the whole state. So the a lot of times they're like the Chicago Public Schools Consortium that works just with Chicago Public Schools, which has as many kids as the whole state of Arkansas. So for us, we're available to all districts. We're available to the State Department. We just want to put our expertise to work to benefit policymakers and parents and students and teachers in the state. So if you're thinking about if this talk springs something for you that you'd like to talk about research in your district, we're absolutely happy to talk about that.
Yeah, and I think that is a great point, because it's not like we are solely blessed and no one else gets the opportunity to work with OEP. So thank you for bringing that up. So this slide, one of the issues that we also noticed was not just how and the challenges of identification, but it's who we are identifying, or potentially who we are not identifying in Arkansas. And so I'll defer to the experts more so on the data here on this slide.
So this slide just shows sort of the percentage of kids overall that are white is about 60% in the state. And in terms of GT students, that's almost 70% of GT students are white. So when the blue bar is higher than the red bar, in this case, we see that those groups of students are being identified at a greater rate than their representation in the population as a whole. Now, this isn't particularly surprising, and it's not just Arkansas. This is across the whole country. But we do see that Black Hispanic students are underrepresented relative to their share of the population. And as we move over and look at students who are eligible for free reduced lunch, we see they are much less likely to be identified than as gifted and talented than their share in the population. Special ed and LEP kids are the least likely to be identified as gifted and talented. And John can speak a little bit more to sort of the ideas behind if we would expect equal representation based upon the population, or if this is a long-term trend.
I mean, I would just say that this pattern is commonly found across a lot of different data sets and states and national data and so on.
So my research on this comes from really an equity lens, which isn't saying that we should, my perspective isn't that, if we have 20% of kids in the state who are Black, that we should have 20% of kids who are gifted who are Black. But I want to make sure that if we have African-American or economically disadvantaged kids who are gifted, that we are catching them and providing them the services that they need. So for me, that's when we don't have good systems in place, there's room for kids and families to not get the services that they need. And so that's part of why I really wanted to do this project, is to make sure that we're doing everything we can to identify the kids.
And from a practitioner side of things, we do get some oversight, which is muchly appreciated from the Department of Education, Division of Elementary and Secondary Education, to make sure that we are addressing or at least aware of any equity gaps in our district. We are encouraged as GT specialists to help our districts identify any gaps that are more than 20% based on a formula that was recommended by Dr. Donna Ford. And just using the publicly disclosed information that any parent, teacher, student, researcher can use at the myschoolinfo.gov, I believe is what I may be butchering it, but it's the MySchoolInfo page that you can look at your district demographics and your GT demographics. And we do see that there are equity gaps, and it's what are we doing? Are we aware of it? And then what are we doing to make sure that we do our best to close those wherever possible? And some of this information is just data, and I believe it's from 2018. Is that right, Sarah?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's pretty consistent.
Okay.
Over time.
So moving into where we, with that assumption that we do know that there are equity issues, that there are challenges that practitioners have, funding being a big one, and obviously resources and access to the training to those resources being a big one. I viewed it as one of the roles of the GT specialist at a co-op is to look at ways that we can help our districts, support our districts in finding ways to overcome those gaps and challenges. And so we were able to partner with the Walton Family Foundation and applying for a grant to do a universal screener over 2 years using the COGAT-8, which is an ability, or it was a cognitive ability test on the quantitative, verbal and nonverbal aspects. And we gave this to all fourth graders last fall, 2019, which most districts participate. I should say 15 of the 16 in Northwest Arkansas participated, which roughly was about 5,000 students. And interestingly, I've always heard universal screening is the best, and localized norming is a second subsequent reality of how to identify your high ability students in your district. And so, interestingly, when I went to Albuquerque this last NAGC year, I watched a presentation at the bottom by McBee and Peters, and they actually provided a free localized norming spreadsheet. So I'll make sure I post that in the chat, as well as those that are watching live on Facebook. And I also posted on our website, giftedarkansas.org, because I think they've provided this as a free resource. And it is really good if you're looking at weighting certain assessments or putting all your data electronically into one location. Did you want to say anything, Jonathan, about the COGAT?
I think that's great, Dustin. Thank you. So there's a resource at the end about David Lohman, who's co-developer with Joni Lakin now, and there's a resource at the end where the paper by David Lohman also is a great supplement to explain the role of local norming in addition to using the COGAT and so on.
And I know we're going pretty quickly, and some of this is probably common knowledge of equity gaps and universal screening, things like that. But if you have questions, you'd like to interrupt us at any time, feel free to do so. But we'll jump into study one. And I'll let Dr. Wai, you want to say this?
Okay, so this study one is basically a study that we kind of set up to begin to explore, trying to figure out how we could develop a universal screener, or how we could find ways to identify an objective indicator that we could use in gifted and talented identification across Arkansas. And so universal screening, as Dustin pointed out, it's been found to identify students from disadvantaged backgrounds, but it also can be costly. The idea with universal screening being useful, one of the background papers is by David Card and Laura Giuliano, published in PNAS, and basically they showed that by using screening all students, you actually can identify more talented students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Another paper by Jason Grissom and Redding also showed something very similar, where it turns out even though, it turns out the screening procedure actually does a really good job of helping disadvantaged kids be identified, as opposed to using the parent-teacher identifier as the primary first step. So, it turns out that the ACT Aspire is a test that already exists. It's an objective indicator of mathematical verbal achievement and academic giftedness, essentially. And so we basically were like, hey, we can actually use this ACT Aspire as a universal screener because everyone already takes it. And maybe if we use this test and we take a look at the top 5% of scorers in math and reading, what happens when we compare that to the GT identifier? If we take the top 5% of the math and the top 5% of the verbal students, would they all be identified GT, right? Or would it only be a part of them? And where's that overlap and where's the disconnect? And so that's kind of our idea, where we figured, hey, we can do that. We can also, as part of the grant, take universally screen on the COGAT. So does the ACT Aspire function in very similar ways the COGAT mathematical and verbal components, or the nonverbal component for that matter? And that allows us to validate the COGAT as another measure. It validates the ACT Aspire as a potential universal screener, and it just gives another objective indicator potentially for the state of Arkansas to use as part of the GT identification process. So next slide, Dustin. Thanks.
And it should be noted that we did not get to give the ACT Aspire last spring due to COVID. We were able to take the third grade ACT Aspire that we gave universally to all kids in the spring of 2019. And we used that data to compare it with the data for the universal screening that we did for all fourth graders in the fall of 2019 as fourth graders. And I think this is you, Sarah.
Oh, John. Yeah, John's still going to finish this one. So no worries. Yeah. So anyways, here's a Venn diagram. And so I described, the GT identified students, and that's that big yellow circle. And keep in mind, this is a Venn diagram for GT students and top 5% students in third grade math and reading in 2019. But this pattern is actually almost identical, replicated across multiple different years and cohorts. So this is a highly replicable pattern across the state in different years for third graders. And so that yellow circle is all the GT identified. The blue circle is basically the top 5% math or verbal. It doesn't really matter. It shows the same kind. Sarah, what is it? And verbal?
This is math and verbal. So we wanted to make it like as strict as possible and just say these are the top 5% in both math and verbal on the
Okay.
AGATE.
Thank you. So it's even more restrictive in that sense. And so essentially you see that the overlap between the top 5% in math and verbal and the GT identified is, it's there, but it's not everybody. So actually it turns out there's a huge proportion, about 30% that are not identified as GT as going through that process, but actually are in the top 5% in math and verbal. And this is a missed percentage. A lot of these students come from disadvantaged backgrounds. Another thing to point out here is that a lot of GT identified students do not actually score in the top 5% in math and verbal, a very, very large proportion. So that's kind of a confusing disconnect in some ways. And that's kind of where we were like, hey, maybe there's something we can do to improve the process.
And
is there anything to add there?
Yeah, one of the things I really liked about the idea for our grant, though, was that we and the research that we were going to do was that we knew several of our districts were already doing universal screenings at first grade or second grade or even third grade, but the majority of them did not do a second universal screener. And so doing a second pass universal screener for all fourth grade, we felt like that could help maybe close that gap of any of our disadvantaged students or underrepresented populations, because maybe they're high mobility or migrant families that were jumping from district to district, or they just moved in from out of state, whatever the reason being. But we just didn't want there to be one and done in terms of when they potentially could be identified.
And I think the other thing I would like to point out, go back.
Oh, sorry.
Is we aren't saying that only students in the top 5% on the state test should be identified gifted. I mean, we identify, as Dustin said at the beginning, about 9% of students on the state on average as gifted. So the question isn't so much about those other kids that are gifted but not in the top 5%. That's fine. I'm worried about those ones that are demonstrably high achieving and are not getting services. And maybe they've been checked and they didn't meet the criteria, but they certainly should be, it should be a flag for giving those kids another look. Okay, that was all.
Okay.
So that was study one, and John explained in general what we found. The second question of study two is sort of, why do we want to make sure that these students do get access to GT? Is there a measurable benefit for Arkansas students? So most of the research, because like I said, we can't randomly assign kids to GT and not to GT. So most of the research is like, wow, these kids were in GT and they're doing great, but you don't have a good counterfactual, right? Like, because those kids were identified for GT for a certain reason. So our question was to sort of dig into this percentage of kids that are high achieving but aren't identified as GT, and let's follow them over time, because like Dr. Wai said, this pattern has happened over and over and over for years and years and years. So we have a good sample of students that are achieving at the same level as kids that are identified GT at as early as 3rd grade, but don't get those services. So what do these differences look like over time? So we examined 3rd to 8th grade standardized achievement on all the state tests for 5 cohorts of students that scored in the top 5% when they were in 3rd grade. It's about 7,000 kids for math and 6,600 for reading. And again, students aren't randomly assigned to GT, so it's not causal. We can't say being in GT made these changes in the students, but it's interesting to look at the trends over time in their academic performance compared to their similarly high achieving peers that just did not get GT services. Does anybody have any questions about that or thoughts that they want to say before we go on?
None in the chat or the Q&A feature so far.
Okay.
It could just be like me as a standard practitioner. I'm just like, yeah, let's get to the summary.
Whatever, get to the picture. Okay. So, so you can go to the next slide, Dustin. Thank you. So the results were very interesting. Among the top 5% of those 3rd grade students who were identified as GT scored similarly to those who were not. So in 3rd grade, these two groups were scoring similarly in the top 5%. In subsequent years, GT identified students consistently score higher on state assessments than their non-GT peers, particularly in mathematics. We see the larger difference in their growth. Differences in achievement, like I said, may not be due to GT programming. They may be, we don't have any idea, but there are likely other factors at play like labeling effects. These kids are now labeled GTs, so maybe they're getting more rigorous curriculum or more positive support from their peers or better teachers, or maybe their parents are more excited about their schoolwork. Now, we don't know what's going on, but we can't say that it's due to GT programming. Okay, next slide.
We do have a question.
Question.
In study 1, what measures were used for students in grades 1 and 2? Let me go back to that slide.
So in study 1, we did not include kids in grade 1 and 2. This is in study 1, we were using 3rd graders and the spring of 3rd grade assessment, if they were in the top 5% on that, and then their GT identifier at the beginning of 4th grade, which is by that time most districts have identified them as 4th grade. So we don't have any good test data on 1st and 2nd grade kids.
And that's also, to my understanding, ACT Aspire doesn't start until 3rd grade. Isn't that correct?
That's right. 3rd grade is the first year that students take a statewide standardized test. That's all the same. Okay, so this is just 2 quick little graphs. This is for cohort 5, which was in 3rd grade in 2013, and then went through 8th grade, 13. Oh, so they start for 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Yeah, so it's 2013 to 2018. These are all the same kids. We follow kids individually over time. So there's not kids in here who moved in or moved out. We kept them all the same. So on the left-hand panel is their percentile on the state math assessment. And you can see that the GT line, the orange line, these are kids who were labeled GT. They're at the 98th percentile on their 3rd grade assessment on average. And so are the non-GT kids, the ones that were not identified GT. As we go to 4th grade, you can see there's a gap. The GT kids are outscoring the non-GT peers. 5th grade, there continues to be a gap. 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. So by the end of 8th grade in mathematics, the GT students are at the 94th percentile and the non-GT kids are at the 92nd percentile. Now they all decline some from that 98th percentile where they started, but that's just regression towards the mean of high achieving students on standardized tests. It's totally to be expected. What's interesting is that there's this gap and that it's a persistent gap across all the grade levels. We don't see it just happening between 7th and 8th. It happens at every grade level. On the right-hand side is ELA. You can see they both started at about the 95th percentile, the GT and the non-GT. And then by 8th grade, GT kids were at the 92nd percentile and non-GT were at the 90th percentile. So I thought that was really interesting because we all do GT differently across every district. Services are administered in a variety of ways. And it's really hard to find anything in education that has a positive long-term effect. And it was surprising to me that kids that started out at the same point ended up at different points relative to their GT identification.
So I guess in summary, one of the things that we have discussed previously is the fact that because districts do a variety of different assessments and they often don't share that data, or because they identify differently from district to district, that does cause some districts to potentially miss some students. There's just not a uniform GT identification assessment or whatnot, but having the ACT Aspire being something that all districts were doing across the state of Arkansas, as a practitioner, I thought this would be a great idea, that if we could validate that as assessment for an ongoing criteria, since all kids are doing it, and it's not just all kids are doing it in 2nd or 3rd or 4th grade, but continuously on into later grades, that this would be a profound impact for all districts to take one less assessment off of something that a GT coordinator or GT teacher is supposed to do. That we could just say, let's use that district data that they're already collecting universally for all kids using the ACT Aspire. So that's one of the things I would say as a big summary for me was the ongoing universal screening, because as a practitioner too, when I first met Dr. Wai, we were under the mindset that you want to test earlier and earlier to help identify those kids and give them services earlier enough, because if you're not providing good qualitative differentiation instruction in the regular classroom, that they're going to start regressing or plateauing by 2nd or 3rd grade. So you want to start servicing them as early as possible, but that also becomes a hiccup because you're generally going to probably identify your more well-to-do students the earlier you're doing it. I think this is probably one of the problems we're seeing with New York that has done some of their identification in kindergarten or some other areas that are similarly having those same problems, but doing a universal screening in later grades, much like the talent identification programs like the Duke TIP, allowing kids to mature and develop and refine their skills or their gifts is perhaps a best practice. And I think that was a flip on its head for me as a practitioner, because like I said, I was taught and trained that we needed to go earlier and earlier rather than more of an ongoing and especially even in later grades. Definitely utilizing the localized norms. We have some districts in Arkansas that are using localized or regional norms for some of their assessments. And I think that is definitely best practices, but understanding how to do that is often a challenge. And so we're trying at the co-op to make sure that we are embedding opportunities for districts to work with their data and look at their district data and their GT data, but also just looking at the student population that's within their district to compare that within district from one side of town to the other side of town, or maybe even just regionally, so that way they can have something more useful and workable rather than just using that national criteria, those national norms. And I don't know if there's anything else either one of y'all wanted to say here.
Well, I'll just say that there's 30% of kids that are demonstrably high achieving that we're missing in our GT selection process. And I will have this paper out by the end of the month, at least study 1. And a part of that is sort of district level not accuracy, but the likelihood that a kid in the top 5% is identified as GT in that district. So if that's something, and we have it broken out by race and poverty and gender, and it's collapsed over 5 years. So it gives you sort of a trend line about that. So if you're interested in that information, you can just reach out to me or have your superintendent reach out to me, and we can, I can give you that data in a context for your district. I'm not going to share your districts with any other district. But it's helpful to look and see like how many of our top 5% kids did we miss over the past 5 years. For me, it's really important that these kids who maybe don't have a parent who will nominate them, or don't catch the eye of the teacher because they aren't acting like a precocious, gifted student, get access to these services, because it seems like they are associated with some long-term benefits, whether it's labeling, whether it's parental, whether it's curriculum, we don't know what it is, but these kids could benefit from access to these services. So I think it's really an important thing to keep thinking about and talking about.
And I think that definitely goes to validate what we do in Arkansas for gifted programming, is that there is a significant statistical difference for those kids that are identified. And it may not be solely because they are in the GT program, because programming changes from district to district, and there's not a set curriculum. It's supposed to replace what they're doing in the regular classroom and extend or replace. But I think that's significant for, as a president of the Arkansas for Gifted Education, to have data that shows that there are statistical differences for the kids that are in the GT program that score better than the other kids in the top 5% that are not identified. So we do have research, the annotated research. I don't know if you want to say anything about this, Dr. Wai.
Oh, just I believe this will be shared, but there's just a number of resources about everything from the universal screening paper I'd mentioned earlier, talking about what a research practice partnership is, Carrie Conaway, Lubinsky and Benbow's States of Excellence, talking about the model of the talent search and how students are identified and developed. David Lohman's, it's a great paper about identifying academically talented minority students. Talking about, David Lohman, talked a lot about why local norms are important and useful. A paper by Elliot Tucker-Drobe, just talking about how the development of abilities across the lifespan it changes over time. And so in terms of identification, the reason why you might want to have multiple points of identification or screening is because students change, they develop differently over time. And ultimately it'd be great if we had a GT identification process and continuous talent development process for all students at multiple developmental points in their education. And then, a great paper by Joyce Van Tassel-Basco on, the ongoing dilemma of identification practices.
So we do have our contact information. And again, Dr. McKenzie said she'd be more than willing to share with you if you would like your district's data. You can copy or take a picture of that, or I will post it in the chat as well. I do think it's important to talk about the elephant in the room, and I'm going to share or stop sharing because I did see a question pop up. There we go. But I do think it's important that when we talk about identification in Arkansas or in general, that a lot of times districts take this very protectively. And so I really am very thankful for the 15 school districts that participated in Northwest Arkansas in this grant, in this research, because it's not easy to reflect and look in, and plus add an additional measurement that they weren't already doing. And so the administrators in those districts and the students and families of the districts, I personally thank you, because this is something that we're working on to do best practices in identifying gifted education. Nobody likes to be told that they're potentially missing a kid or missing students. And I think that's hard for anybody to see. But I think if we're going to get better, we have to reflect on what we potentially can do better. So that's a big part of what I found as a great aspect of this research practice partnership, is that we did have willing stakeholders and participants willing to share data and analyze what they're currently doing to come up with some better practices. But because it is a very protective idea of how we do it, we know there are parent blogs out there where moms and dads will practice with their kids and coach their kids on things. So some districts are not willing to share what they do in terms of the identification practices, and that's understandable. But in terms of research and how we can get better, it's just one more obstacle that we had to overcome. So with that said, I did see a question. You mentioned that many districts were doing universal screening in the 1st and 2nd grade. What assessments were they using at the earlier grade level? I guess the answer to that is it varies tremendously, and that's the problem that I've seen as a GT specialist, because I just thought this is the GT test and everyone's doing it. And then when I became a specialist, and I'm like, I have 16 districts that I work with, and really not a single one uses the same assessment. Some use the SAGES, and then I hear others that practitioners or even researchers at NAGC that may criticize it. Some use rating scales or those subjective parent scales, where it's like, does your child do this, this, and this? And it's like a checkbox. And as a dad, I'm like, yeah, my son does this, my daughter does that. But others are like, well, let's move away from those checkboxes and do more open responses and see, kind of pull it out of them to see, do your kids really need the GT services? So I know that doesn't answer your question, but it's because there's not a general assessment that kids or districts are doing in the 1st and 2nd grade. I don't know if y'all want to add to that at all.
No, there's a couple chat points.
Okay, pull that up. There it is. All right. Oh yeah, there's quite a few. The next one, I'm concerned that if we were to go just to looking at ACT Aspire or something purely academic, we would miss many of the creative students and those that think outside the box. Either one of you want to talk about that?
Well, I can start with that. Like I said, we identify 9% of our students in the state as gifted and talented. And in our study, John and I only looked at those kids that were in the top 5%, both math and verbal. There's a lot of room for other kids that aren't in that top 5%. My concern is there's a lot of kids that are in that top 5% that are not being identified. So I don't want to shut down any of the other opportunities. And the question about how these creativity assessments are correlated with the academic assessments is one that we're really interested in looking at, because it's sort of like if I'm making a soup, right, and I put in all the ingredients and one of them is 4 cups of water, and then I add in 2 cups of chicken stock or whatever, like how much is each of those ingredients really changing the outcome of the soup? And I'm not sure that we have good evidence as a research base yet that the creativity assessments identify a different group of students than the academic assessments would consistently. And if we're identifying students for creativity, we should be providing them enhanced creativity opportunities for those students. Someone who's gifted in math is maybe different than someone who's gifted creatively. And we don't differentiate statewide our programming that well for different gifts. But I'm not saying we should just go to the ACT Aspire. I'm saying we should for sure look at the ACT Aspire to make sure we haven't inadvertently overlooked some students that could benefit from the services.
And I will also note that it is still required in the GT standards to do a creativity assessment, whether it's a subjective or an objective test. So that's not being taken out of the equation. John, do you want to add anything?
I'll just jump in and say, yeah, thank you, Sarah and Dustin. I have a paper out with Joni Lake and called Finding Missing Einsteins in Contemporary Educational Psychology, where we allowed a number of different measures to compete, including math, verbal, spatial. Also, a creativity measure is a word fluency kind of creativity, not necessarily representative creativity, but it turns out that creativity does do a reasonable job in terms of identifying some underrepresented groups and students. And so I'm not saying at all to necessarily just say, like, just as what Sarah expressed, it's not necessarily ruling out other measures per se. At the same time, David Lohman has talked about how the symbol systems in schools that are actually, the reason why we actually use them for gifted identification, according to David Lohman at least, is that these are the simple systems, the mathematical and verbal simple systems that schools actually do build upon and actually have services for. Now, whether you believe that, say, for example, I've argued that spatial reasoning, for example, is important for schools and systems, but you also, if you're going to select on spatial reasoning, you have to have a curriculum for spatial reasoning for those students with those talents. And so the idea is thinking if the math and verbal talented students who are objectively academically advanced are not actually getting services, but schools are actually set up for those kids, like, well, we should do something to help them, right? And I think that's kind of what Sarah was getting at as well. So
we had another question. When trying to have a broader net to identify more diversity, it seems we also identify more non-minority population. Do you find that identifying later is a better practice? Typically identifying students earlier only identifies students who read early.
that's from Tim. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm reading it right now, Tim. Hang on. Or anyone else want to respond?
And I'll let y'all decide that because you're the researchers.
So read the Tucker-Drove paper that I mentioned in the references. I know that when David and Camilla and I would talk about this, the talent search typically had occurred around 7th grade because the abilities had kind of crystallized in that population by age 12. And so the idea is, so part of the early identification that Dustin mentioned about the unreliability of real identification is that there is that aspect of parents coaching and other things like that. So later, yeah, I mean, it would be better if there was a good, reliable identification at every age, but we just can't do that. So it's like you want to try to find a good, reasonable point to say this is a good place to identify and provide challenges. Maybe do it the next year too, or maybe a few years later. So we're dealing with a cut score issue. So.
And limited resources, right? You have limited spots in your GT classrooms. You have limited time that you can spend with those GT students. So, that's where the art comes in, along with the science, is identifying which kids are most in need of these services. And that's a local decision, and it will remain a local decision. We're just trying to help you some more information and some more tools to do that.
And so, Jonathan, you might be able to help with this next question. With the news of the closing of the Duke TIP program for the remainder of the 2020-2021 school year, what are some of the panelists' thoughts regarding the consequences of the identification ending, or of that identification program ending?
So, I think this is I have a strong opinion about that as a person who believes in talent identification. I think the talent identification program closing, it was one of the largest. So it wasn't a universal screener per se, but it was probably the most universal thing out there around 7th grade. And I know the stereotype is that selection process picked up a lot of advantaged students, which is true. There were those students. But if the purpose of gifted identification is to help students develop to the fullest, to develop excellence, that's a real disappointment for talent selection being removed, like a universal screener like that being removed, because it identified a lot of students who are actually disadvantaged too. In fact, across the last 30, 40 years, that program did more to identify disadvantaged students from all kinds of backgrounds. It gave those students and those parents sometimes the ability to have leverage to go to schools and say, hey, my student actually is performing really well in this TIP program. And now you need to do something to help serve my child, at the level. So the idea with the talent selection is that's the learning rate of the student. And here, how can I get an education that matches that learning rate, whether it's acceleration or whether it's just math acceleration or something else. And so the consequences of that actually, even though I understand in some ways it's for equity, it actually may have negative unintended consequences against equity, because a lot of these students who were disadvantaged and identified with that program actually may not be able to get services now because no one's objectively identified them. So.
And if you're okay, I may do a plug. I know Springdale School District is looking at doing their own version of a potential ACT Aspire or ACT testing with the pre-ACT. since it's a simplified version and it's small, or it doesn't cost as much. I know the Duke Tip full-blown ACT costs $50. The pre-ACT version, which has been out just for a few years, I believe, is like $12. So that is an alternative if any of our districts are willing to give the pre-ACT, because it's something I think that you can start now in October all the way through June, and you can administer it locally and you utilize that as one of your later identification for talent programming. So shout out to Springdale for that.
And the ACT is also going to be super correlated with the ACT Aspire, right? So it's back to that soup and water thing. Like what additional information are you getting from the ACT as opposed to just using the data that we already have about how kids are doing on the ACT Aspire? So I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I think it's super interesting. I'd love to look at your data and we can find out how correlated they are for these kids. But, you know, one of the passions of my work is like, let's use the data that we have for as much good as we can, because we're taking time out of those kids learning to administer these assessments. So they should be really, you know, well worn and utilized.
Thank you for saying that.
You're welcome.
Because I know that's the other problem about GT identification is that it does take time away from instruction, and parents have to do the approval process. And I know administrators, especially right now with a lot of online and on-site divisions of learning, that there's just not enough time for doing this. So we have temporarily put a hold on our universal screener for fourth grade because we couldn't really figure out at this point how to do a universal screener for the kids at home and on site, especially when they're bouncing back. There are some districts that allow the kids week to week, and there's others every 9 weeks, and some at semester. So we're all in this, and we know that there are obstacles and challenges that no one foresaw this time last year, but we have postponed it. We do hope to pick this back up for next fall for a continuation of the universal screener for fourth graders. I don't see any other questions, and we probably have time for one or two more if there are any other last, but if not, I see Missy Hickson at the Northwest Arkansas Education Service Cooperative said, great stuff. Thanks, Missy. All right. Oh, there might be one more that popped in. Oh, I didn't answer hers. Anyway, well, I will say then we'll stop there. I want to thank Dr. Jonathan Wai and Dr. Sarah McKenzie for giving us their evening to do this presentation, but also their time and energy in this project, because this has not been something we just magically developed. It's been probably a 2-year conversation in the works, and there's been lots of emailing and Zooming nowadays. So I personally thank you for all your work on behalf of this, because it is an elephant that we are trying to take a bite of one day at a time to overcome, and it's a constantly moving target. So it's even more difficult for that process. But thank you all for those that tuned in for us live on Facebook, as well as on a Tuesday evening. So, all right, well, that's it for now. Thank you very much.